The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good afternoon and welcome to the Amec webinar on award-winning measurement. We'd like to warmly welcome our guests throughout Asia Pacific to a very special webinar on how to write killer awards entries and why are some companies more successful than others at the Amec Awards. So thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. It will be a short and very informative event, hopefully, and we're looking forward to hearing from a number of people here. We'll just move through the slides and let's have a look at the next slide that we've got. Okay, we've got myself here on the left, Michael Ziviani. I'm the CEO of Precise Value in Australia and also co-chair of Amec through Asia Pacific. We've got Marion McDonald coming to us out of Hong Kong, who's the Managing Director of Ogilvy PR, and Carly Chalice, Insights Manager for iSentia, also here in Australia. Both of my colleagues here have extensive experience entering awards and also some experience judging them. So we're looking forward to bringing to bear that experience this afternoon for your entry benefit of winning awards. Let's move forward and get into the next slides. Firstly, to introduce Amec, the International Association for Measurement and Evaluation of Communication. It is the global trade body and professional institute for both agencies and practitioners who provide media evaluation and communications research. It was formed in London back in 1996 and has grown to be the global communications body for communications research. You may ask, why is communications research important? It's a very key point today as to prove your value and your value to the client so you can deliver what you promise and you can deliver and show that value to people and justify fees. So the defining and development of the industry is a key objective of Amec, and we'll talk through what that means today in terms of both professional standards for companies and individuals. Let's look at the next slide about the awards now. The Amec Award is the only truly international awards scheme for PR and communications measurement. It's 13 years old this year, and it aims to recognise and celebrate exceptional work and accomplishments, bringing together programs of research, measurement and analytics, especially since the adoption of the Barcelona Principles framework. Now, many of you may have heard of these principles, but I'd encourage you to visit the Amec site, and you will see a link there at the bottom of the slides, amecorg.com, where you'll find a lot of information and a huge resource pool of presentations and different guides. So this is a very valuable resource which you can access, and if you're a member of Amec, you can access even more resources there as well. So I'd encourage you to consider membership as well. The categories this year are separately grouped. There's a whole range of different categories that you can enter into, which allows you to only compete with the areas that are relevant to you. That includes private sector, government, and not-for-profit organisations. There's also a range of new categories this year that you'll find at this link at the bottom here. So I'd encourage you even now to pop over to the amecorg.com website and put that in the browser as well, so you can have a look at that a bit later on. And let's move on to the next slides. Okay, I'll hand now to Marion in Hong Kong.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for joining us today, everybody. I have had the privilege of being involved with Amec Awards for several years now and chaired the jury last year and will again this year as well, a role that I particularly enjoy because it gives me and fellow jurors an opportunity to see some of the best work around PR effectiveness. One thing we've learned from looking at all of these entries is to really identify standout cases quite quickly and the kind of factors that help get cases shortlisted. So I'm going to share with you, together with Carly today, who also has a lot of experience in identifying great cases, is 3 golden rules for success. So 3 very simple rules, but we're going to make it very practical and show lots of example cases, including some of the past award winners from the last year or so of our Amec awards, so you can actually physically see what do these cases write, how do they express these 3 golden rules in order to get shortlisted. So the rules that we're going to look through, no doubt you've read them already, they're on screen now. Firstly is to define a business problem versus a communications task. So cases that stand out for us really understand how the work that they are doing in measuring a program or designing an effectiveness program bring value to a company, and that is in terms of its impact on their sales, revenue, or significant impact on reputation in such a way that it improves their business performance. So a business problem focused around a financial return. The second of these is obviously proving how great you were with terrific evidence of the work that links back to those business goals. And the third is we all enjoy a good story. For entrants, and including myself, as our own company Ogilvy enters quite a bit of work in these awards, we may work on 1 to 4 or 5 cases to enter. Judges may review anywhere from 40 and upwards cases. So it is hard to stand out, and we appreciate a really well-written and interesting story about the challenges that you've solved. So dramatizing it certainly doesn't hurt. So let's get into them. I'm going to pass back and forth to Carly throughout these 3 golden rules, who's got some great examples to illustrate it. So the first one is, what's the business problem that we're solving? So I have given some examples here, and these are actually from Amec members' work, where a brief from a client might have been to shape the bleach dialogue online, but the real business problem that we're solving is around increasing usage occasions of bleach. And so once we set out a more clear, specific business objective, we know exactly then what we're measuring when we design a measurement program. Have we increased bleach volume usage significantly? And similarly, in the second example, the business problem is around a very specific target audience and a very specific message and behavioral shift, or rather attitudinal shift we want them to have around self-diagnosed eye strain. So the kind of cases that stand out speak very specifically to the column on the left, answering a business problem, and describe the column on the right as part of the activities they undertook. But not the business problem that they are solving. They define that very clearly. So again, to make this really practical, let's look at some case studies. I'll share the first one because it's an Ogilvy case from our Ogilvy China team. And this was a case that we had a lot of success with at the Pambassador entry last year at the Amec Awards and other awards, because it was extremely focused around a tourism growth rate objective. So we'd set a goal that our campaign needed to drive tourism growth to significantly outperform China's own national growth rate in this one western city of Chengdu, and given in there the forecasts of what we expected that tourism growth rate to be. So very focused around an end result. You'll notice it's not around achieve coverage for Chengdu, and the case didn't stop at change impressions about Chengdu as being a city that was home of the pandas, a green and friendly city to visit. It actually had to go all the way through to the ultimate goal was, by changing impressions, by increasing visitation, we would grow the tourism visitation rate and also tourist spending, which we also shared in the case study. So there's a first example. Carly's got a couple of lovely examples that take a slightly different approach. So Carly, over to you to introduce the next one.
Thank you, Marianne. Hello, everybody that has joined us. I'll be talking through 2 examples. The first is Pegasus, and their campaign was called Inspiring Healthy Decisions. The business goal was very clear. It was based on a consultancy firm that really wanted to make measurement a priority for their business. So they conducted 2 anonymous surveys within the business. The first one was in March 2013. The second was in March 2014. The goal really was to increase the effectiveness of their work, to help retain clients and staff by improving their ability to set great objectives and demonstrate the impact of our work. And there's a very important part of the business goal on this slide, which is in the middle, therefore increasing fee revenue. So that there's a financial goal to be made here from introducing and prioritizing measurement as part of their business. Moving on to the second slide. The second case study we have here is from Isentia, and this won an award last year in Amsterdam. It was an incredibly complicated submission to write for the Amec Awards, but we did struggle through it. The business goal was really part of a larger goal for our Australian Human Rights Commission. Their aim is to expose prevailing stereotypes of older people in the media, raise awareness of age discrimination in the community, as well as to change the nation's attitudes and behaviours towards older people for the better. Now that's a very, very broad goal, and our part of this, our contribution to the Australian Human Rights Commission and this project was obviously much more smaller and very specific. Our mission was to determine the proportion of editorial media coverage and advertising that featured older people, and that allowed us to make an assessment of the invisibility of older people in the Australian media relative to their presence in the population. Once we had that proportion, we also examined how older people are portrayed in the media and the extent to which this content created and perpetuated stereotypes about older people. It was extremely complicated to convey in an award submission, but really the goal is to change attitudes and behaviours, and we contributed to the Australian Human Rights Commission to give them evidence to start to do that. Thank you. Next slide.
Thanks, Carly. Great cases and quite different. So we wanted to make sure we have a mix of different kinds of work covered on this webinar today to illustrate it across all kinds of entries that you might be preparing. The second step, once we have such a great objective and clear business objective set, is to prove the results that we are delivering. So with quantified results and sources given. This is where we really separate the great cases that almost as you're reading them as a judge, you can see this is immediately going to be on the short list. The results are very, very clear, and they answer exactly against the objectives that are given, the business objective that's given. And it goes well beyond speaking generally about what was achieved into very specifically, step by step, how did that result prove that our campaign had worked? So drawing a direct link between the efforts and the outputs and therefore the business results that we saw. I like to use a little structure for this, that is, start with business results directly against the objective that was set. And in fact, it's kind of a little golden rule in Ogilvy. We have an objective, we have a matching result every time. So we make sure we answer that objective directly. And then we use intermediate results, which might be, if you're familiar with the Amec measurement framework, would be the impact area in the middle and the outputs and how they tallied up to prove the business outcome that the case delivered. So the business results are supported by intermediate results. For example, we were able to show that this campaign delivered a higher level of engagement than competitors or previous campaigns. We were able to track new leads generated, or we did some tracking to understand awareness of this message we were talking about and why these are proof measures to deliver that business impact that we're looking for. Again, let's get straight into examples to highlight it better. So I'll go back to our dancing pandas around the world for Chengdu government again. Our actual results, I lead in with the business result. Our business ambition was to drive tourism growth. So the first result that I show is that visitors to Chengdu were up by 30.3% against overall China visitors up only 1.2%. And in fact, our measurement year was a soft year for China tourism growth, which made the results that we achieved for Chengdu, the western city, look even stronger. We then went on to the intermediate measures in here. Not highly sophisticated, and a lot of people ask if this is really difficult to get or the client didn't want to pay for all this kind of work. We actually did a Facebook-based tracker study, replicable and a decent sample size for each market because we wanted to share it more broadly with media. But we used awareness of Chengdu and being associated with pandas, tracked it across 3 key markets in the campaign. The other intermediate measure we looked at was around engagement, and because the campaign was based through Facebook, that was the central hub for the Pambassador campaign, we looked at our Facebook PTAT, or People Talking About This score, as a measure, and we compared the PTAT score we achieved for Chengdu against similarly large budget national tourism campaigns for Australia, London and New Zealand. At the time, I think they were releasing another Hobbit movie, so there was yet another big burst of coverage around tourism New Zealand. So looked at those engagement rates as an intermediate measure. We wanted to be able to show that video views, Facebook comments alone and likes are not enough. They're a great output, but they'd had an impact in terms of the engagement in the content, and they'd created a change in awareness through our tracker study that laddered up to driving a change in visitors. So that's the Pambassador business results. I'll pass over to Carly to talk through our other 2 cases for Pegasus and Isentia.
Thank you, Marion. The Pegasus results section really does stand out to me when you look through the case studies. The whole case study, which is available on the Amec website, is a fantastic resource for you to look at how these tips and tricks come to life. And I think the strongest part of the section of the Pegasus submission was the results section, because as you can see in these points, they had some very, very strong business outcomes that they stated clearly. The first one was that 79% of their staff were now putting measurement as a priority with their projects. The second one was that 96% saw positive reaction from clients and prospective clients. The third business result was that 75% of their staff saw that campaign quality had improved as a result of putting measurement as a priority. And the last one, probably the most important as well, is that this helped them win at least 2 new clients and had helped contribute to revenue growth of 25%. So as Marion said, sticking to the business outcomes really made this award submission stand out from the crowd. I'd really recommend everyone go through and look at it, because there are some really nice tips about the strategy and the execution that are helpful too. I'll move on to the next slide to talk about the Isentia case study now. The results for the Isentia case study for Urbis were really to provide that clear evidence to the Human Rights Commission. So on the left-hand side, the results were, in effect, a report that was published by the government. We provided clear evidence that older people are underrepresented in the Australian media. We also provided clear evidence that mainstream news media content most often presented older people as passive, vulnerable, and frail. So the findings and the data that we supplied to the Human Rights Commission allowed them to go on public record to publish a report and to create a media campaign to call to action government stakeholders, corporate Australia, and a number of other stakeholders that were very important. And the final statement here that was written by our Age Discrimination Commissioner, Susan Ryan, was that she called for more accuracy in reporting for older Australians to be presented in a more balanced and diverse manner to reflect more realistically their value, capability and experience. The benefits for our economy, for corporate Australia and for older Australians themselves are clear. So really what the Isentia contribution to this project made was to provide the evidence in order to have the Australian Human Rights Commission go on to influence key stakeholders. Thank you.
So thank you, Carly. Great case there, also demonstrating the outcomes and proving the results achieved. So I'll move on to the final golden rule. We all love a hero. Be the team who worked on it, the great client who got behind it, the new discovery as part of this. This is what we really enjoy when we read through all of the cases, is understanding just how hard it was to achieve this and the level of innovation that this case brings to solving that business challenge. This is also what makes the cases really interesting to read on the website, as Carly said, is to go back and understand these stories and how to tell good stories. Strangely, PR, people and measurement people, although being great at communicating for their clients, tend to be not quite as strong at telling their own story and sometimes lose some of the drama and the interest in the story here. So if you have a great copywriter, content writer, editor in your team, do put them on to helping to tell this case really well, telling the story. Finding a hook in the story, why does it matter, is helpful. For Chengdu, the hook in the story was quite a crucial one for the country's economic development. And that is that China suffers from this great east-west divide. Tourism generally goes straight into Shanghai and Beijing, which are on the eastern seaboard, and therefore all of the tourism revenue, jobs, infrastructure development goes to the east coast of the country. As a result, it gets about 80% of the wealth, but China's western provinces, which have all the land mass, far higher population, tend to miss out on that same rate of development. So we told our story around securing the city's future economic growth prospects. We also wove in some interesting drama, I've not shared it all here, around the fact that China had used Facebook, ironically, as the home of this campaign. And of course, as many of you would know, Facebook is actually banned in China. So while China was attracting the rest of the world to come and visit China through Facebook, its own citizens couldn't actually see the campaign, technically, unless they were using their VPNs. Not that anybody does that in China, of course. Hasten to add. So there's some interesting stories and some great content stories to play on in that case to make it more interesting. Carly, over to you for Isentia.
Thank you. Unfortunately, Isentia didn't have pandas, Marion. Our story revolved around older Australians, and it was a very complicated story to tell. We spent a number of days looking over our submission, and it took us a long time to really discover the point that you've just made, Marion, which was that we needed to add a short highlights section for the judges, that they didn't have time or perhaps the patience to read through all of the details involved with this complicated project. So with the highlights section, using call-out boxes and concise dot points, our aim was to demonstrate the scale and the national importance of the project. We used language like it was a first of its kind analysis, and we also emphasised that 3 different research firms worked collaboratively across methodologies and data sets to meet an ambitious brief. So we used language very carefully. We spent a lot of time trying to make it as user-friendly as possible for the judges. It was still quite a complicated tale, but we used some techniques in formatting and dot points and language that hopefully helped to tell the story in a way that somebody that wasn't sitting in Australia could actually see that this was a project of national significance.
Great, and I love your point, Carly, about using call-out boxes and bullet points. I like to use headings, like dramatic headings on individual sections as well. So in this last section, Carly and I have put together a collection of tips to help you prepare your entry, aside from those golden rules on the content, is here's some more short tips from each of us. The first is bear in mind that the judges do not know all industry sectors possibly. It's hard for anyone on the judging panel, particularly client judges who might be from a specific industry, and we have a great selection of client judges on the panel again this year. They cannot know all of the background and benchmarks for healthcare, for necessarily for FMCG, for tourism, even for what it's like to change measurement culture in your own agency. May not have been through that experience. So providing some background and some benchmarks is really important, and killing the jargon. We get murdered by jargon trying to judge entries. And frankly, if I'm not a specialist on some fields, I just don't understand the jargon. It goes over my head. A quick example of that is in Pambassador case, we kept using China's national tourism growth rate as comparison for Chengdu. So we had some kind of benchmark as to what was going on in the country. Internally in Ogilvy, just to share an amusing story about it, we're very fond of, if we increase sales of something, to try and make very tangible the amount of additional product that was sold. I've seen examples from, we sold enough additional kitchen roll to wrap the Great Wall of China 7 times around, or enough Brita filters sold to remove 300,000 plastic bottles from landfill every day. So another well-known case. Or I even tried myself once, as we were trying to increase rice consumption in Taiwan because it was in the country's national interests to eat more domestically produced rice, to converting to how much more rice that represented. But once we got to 21 Olympic-sized swimming pools of rice, we decided that was starting to look like a pretty silly comparison and gave up on that analogy. But some way that you can make the benchmarks really relevant. For example, did contributing to a 1% share increase, is that worth several $100 million in revenue in that particular category? Or is that extremely hard to do and a key competitor took 3 years to get there? So that might be very helpful to understand the significance of your achievement. And help the judges time-wise. I was just sharing with Michael and Carly as we started this webinar that I'm working on a pitch at the moment where you have very tough word limits for everything, as we do in award entries as well. Where possible, I like to use a whole lot less words than the word limit. I hate when something says you have maximum 1,000 words, to be at 999 and working out how to cut out those last 3 or 4 words. I'd rather tell the story really well in 500 or 600 words, spare the judges some time and be really succinct with it. One of the key areas to focus on in entries to do that is to cut down on the execution detail. Tell a better business objective story, tell a great results story, but really cut back on the execution. And I've seen execution right down to names of venues that event was held in, or the cities in which they visited the media in to collect all this information. And frankly, it's far too much detail when you're judging that many entries. So keeping it light on the detail. Another thing I should have mentioned actually in benchmarks is using a common currency. I know we have a lot of participants from India today, which is fantastic. I look forward to seeing a lot more Indian entries in the Amec Awards this year. But telling me that you had achieved X number of luck, like 7 luck improvement in something, means nothing, because I don't understand what luck is. And I have judges on the jury from all over the world who will not go to Wikipedia to find out, who will not go and convert currencies. There isn't time. To be honest, we're often sitting down doing these late at night after our day jobs, and the last thing that stressed, tired judges feel like is getting on a currency converter site to convert every single number that you use in your entry back into a US dollar or a euros or an equivalent that they can quickly grasp the impact of. So keeping it simple also with the numbers, currencies, and references that you make. All right, I'll pass over to Carly to continue on with the rest of the tips. That's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you very much, but we're happy to take questions. Feel free, you can type in questions as we go through or ask them to Michael at the end.
Thank you, Marion. That was so helpful. I've actually been taking notes as you've been talking myself. Thank you. When we get to language, and I've already spoken a little bit about the types of things that you can do to create interest and to emphasize the importance of the projects that you're nominating. But it's very important not to exaggerate and go overboard to the extent that you arouse suspicion with the judging panel. And an example here that we've included is this bold, convention-changing campaign broke new ground for insightful communications measurement. Now, I think that any judge would probably, at the end of the day, be very suspicious about such an exaggerated statement. So the advice today is to surprise the judges by being concise and disarmingly honest instead. And this really came through when we were working with our URBUS entry. We had to be very careful that we weren't claiming that we had achieved what the other measurement companies that we work with had. So we were very, very careful to present the information of what our role in this project was, so that we weren't saying that we saved the world by this, but we played a key role for our client. So avoiding repetitive exaggeration is a key tip. Planning and the process is one of the most important things, so there are some really good tips here. Make sure you answer clearly and succinctly the criteria for that category. Be ruthless here. Make sure that you have somebody else checking it and go through and make sure you really are on point. Include a supporting quote from the client about the value of your work, not how great you are. I know it's sometimes quite difficult to get a client testimonial, but it really does add value to the submission. The third point here is that several rounds of interview review before submission really helps. And review it and review it and review it. Make sure there are no typos. The second last point here is to start early. Don't leave it to the last minute. As we said before, those winning entries really do take time, and it's the changes that you make in those few days that you give yourself that really do add value to the final cut. Lastly, get early client approval to submit an entry. This is something very important because you may actually waste a lot of time into a submission and then realize that you can't actually enter it in because the client has pulled their support of it. So very important to keep the clients on board and run a transparent process aware on where you are at with that submission and the client. We at Isentia start talking about the Amec Awards at the time that we are selling the report, so that from before they have commissioned the project with us, they are aware that we are Amec members. They are aware that we would really like to submit their work into the Amec Awards in the coming years. So it's very important to get that early so that so that you can avoid last-minute dramas. Next slide.
Sorry, Carly. Apologies for this. Apologies for the slightly spastic hand there as my hand went over the mouse on the Mac. Carry on.
Marion, I like a challenge. It was fine. Lastly here, we've compiled an Amec Awards strategy checklist. And this is just something that has really helped us over the years, and it does include some things that we've learnt along the way. The first thing is, and I've mentioned this previously, is to make it a priority for your business. Winning entries take time. If you don't have the support of your CEO, please go and get it. Try and campaign to get the resources and the time you need to devote to your entries. It really will make a difference. The second point here, and this is a bit of fun, and we do it here at Isentia, is to establish a committee to decide and play judge before you submit your entries. So this is an empowering process. You can get colleagues involved in the Amec Awards, and you can really be critical of what you're putting forward before you actually enter it. It's a very good way to review it, and it's a very good way to identify the weaknesses in some of your entries and before you need to submit it. The third point here, we really encourage fierce debate over every entry. So we have a number of people that review them. We review these submissions over and over again, and our mantra really is, if in doubt, leave it out. So if it doesn't really stand out as something that will really impress the judges, we tend not to enter it. The next point is something that we actually did last year for the Urbis report. We only had one report from the time period that really stood out to us as something that we were proud of and something that the judges might like. So instead of trying to enter in other reports, we actually just entered one report from the Australian business and entered it into different categories. Now, obviously, this is budget permitting. It differs from company to company, but we thought that we would have a better chance putting one report into two categories than two reports into two separate categories, and that seems to have been the case.
And Carly, if I may jump in there, that answers a great question from Durgesh Garg. Thank you very much for your question about how to choose which is the best category to submit. And you're right, you can put the same entry into several categories. So go through the criteria. Certainly, I know last year we entered Pambassador in about 4 or 5 different categories which were relevant, covering social media, the measurement framework for it, multi-country campaigns, single country campaign, and so on. So you'll qualify for a number of categories, and we encourage you to look at that and choose multiple categories. It does increase your chances. But then I tend to slightly rewrite the entry to make sure it answers very specifically the criteria for that one category. Thanks, Carly.
That's a really important point. Yeah, really important point. You do have to tailor the submissions to that category. The next point is to ensure that you're responding to all of the feedback from the judges for the following year. So we had some very constructive feedback that we got following the Amec Awards last year, and one of the pieces of feedback was that one of the awards was submitted into the wrong category. So we'll take that on board this year. We really go into this process with open eyes. We're here to learn all that we can. So really taking on board every word of that feedback and making sure that we use that feedback in the next year. We also, in line with that, really try and keep on top of Amec's priorities as a whole, and you can see by the award categories, by the work that Amec does online, that there is a real trend towards digital and social campaigns, but also a really strong theme of innovation. So if you are aware of the Amec's broad direction, I think, and weave that into your responses, I think that it'll be successful. The second last point here is something that we do a lot, and it's to study the winning case studies on the Amec website. And that's not limited to just the year that's gone by. We go back and we revisit previous years. When I say study, we study them over and over again. I can recommend the Pegasus brief on the Amec website. We've also really got value out of some of the Kantar case studies in the past. So look at people that have really led the way in previous years and really try and adopt some of the strategies that they've used. That really has helped us over the last couple of years. The last point here is to pay keen attention to the weightings. Read it carefully, make sure you understand the weightings, and make sure you're giving your business the maximum opportunity for maximum points in each criteria. Thank you. That's the Amec Awards Strategy Checklist.
Thank you, Carly. If I can just, Michael, cut in for a second too. Another question that came up recently on the US webinar around Amec Awards was around the time period for results, and some entrants finding it difficult to get enough data in place in time for the entry. One of the things that I changed on the Amec Awards last year, working with Barry and the team at Amec, was to change the period in which the work had occurred to allow for a longer period to be able to gather results. So it used to be that cases you submitted had to be work from the previous 12 months. We extended that to work from the previous 18 months so that if a campaign had run in the previous year, but you didn't have results in time for the next year, that you could submit it the year after. So given you've got that 18-month window, do look back a little bit further in your work to see what you now have good results for that you didn't have last year and can enter. And that may give rise to some new cases you can submit.
Thanks, Marion. And I just wanted to add a couple of further points to that. But firstly, a very thorough overview there, and there's not much that I would add to, if anything, to the points that you've made very well today. Importantly, I think one of the things about the Barcelona principles is that they set a framework for how to approach this. And we really touched on the idea of weaving through the Amec philosophy, if you like, to your entry. And that's very important because one of those Barcelona principles states that the AVEs, or advertising value equivalent, or advertising space rate, is not a valid measure. So I'd encourage you to look at that, look at the website of Amec for other measures, the most important of which are the volume of coverage, the tone or sentiment of that coverage, and the size of the media or the platform that delivered that coverage. And have a thorough review of this information before you set about your entry. And the other point I'd underscore from Marion is the value to the main part of the business from the public relations or the media activity. That's a very important point to focus on, and her summary of 1%, what's that worth in awareness or consideration or some other measure that gives you a business result will immediately take the judges to lifting your mark for that entry. And I speak from experience because I am a judge on the SABRE Awards, the Golden Targets, the Effies and the Amec. So I'd encourage any further final questions now to sum up. And again, thank my team and colleagues and yourselves for attending today and joining us for this seminar, this very rich sharing of information. Any other questions there, Marion?
Yep, got one final question come through, which is from Asim in India. Thank you, Asim. Great that you're with us today. So Asim says, in India, most of the time our engagements don't allow us a view into the impact on business, and the focus tends to stay on the output measures around communications. So what tips can we provide to get there? And great question, because I have to confess, internally, often with our own cases, also at Ogilvy, we're very focused on all of the KPIs that were around outputs. And only when we get into starting to talk with a client about entering their work do we tend to get into the discussion with them, quite honestly, around what was the impact on their business. So from my experience, and I'll ask Carly and Michael also to comment, it comes from discussion with the client around the impact on the business, cooperation with a client in putting together the case study, because often they'll give you some wonderful, rich backstory around the challenge and how difficult that was to achieve, and therefore give you a quote that's very relevant to the impact that you had on their business. So great question. It comes from talking to your client. Carly, Michael, anything from your own experiences you would add to that?
I'd suggest that if you cannot get that outcome information, then acknowledge that in your entry and do a very, very good job of the outcome information. That is the outcomes of the media, the outputs rather of the media to do with the volume, the tone and the sentiment. So this is important. But the second point is a more subtle one from yours, Marion, which is that once you have this discussion with the client, you are showing and proving how you can add more value to them. You're showing them an understanding of how the media connects with their business, and this in turn, this understanding you're offering has a value to them. So if you frame it in that context, you will often find that the client will be far more open to sharing information to you if you offer to do this analysis. Because at the end of the day, you're probably not charging for that analysis. It's to show you the effort has given a return. Carly, anything to add?
Yes, that's right. We do find it a key challenge here too. Not all of our clients will share that, and we do find that it is a key limitation for us in the Amec Awards. But in turn, it actually does drive us and makes us really sort of appreciate the projects and the awards that we do receive. It comes down from the very first time that you speak with the client and making sure that you do everything that you can to become a partner with that client so that they feel that they can share their strategy where they want to go, and we can measure how they're going, and then we can really have that high-level conversation about the outcomes and the business results as a result of that. You often don't get to that unless you have that trusted advisor status with your client.
Thanks, Carly. All right, well, look, thank you. I'll draw the line there if everyone's happy with that. No more questions, Marion?
No further questions have come through.
Terrific. Well, thanks again to all the panelists and importantly to you guys out there, the audience. Just a final slide here to suggest that the penultimate event of the year for Amec is in fact the annual summit, which is to occur this June, the 3rd and 4th of June, for a lovely trip to Stockholm. Encourage your CEOs with the value of that information you will bring back and the richness of the connections and networks you will make, because it will also be a lovely spring in Stockholm. So please join us there. Register now. Registrations are open. A terrific event, and more on that on the website. Thanks again for Ogilvy for hosting the seminar today, and for everyone for the amount of work that's gone in to produce it. And goodbye to everyone.
Thank you and goodbye.